After my previous keyboard video, I wasn't really sure where to take things next. But with the positive reception of keyboard content on the channel, I knew for sure that a sequel had to come sooner or later. The push came from the great people over at JLC PCB, who emailed me and offered to make their 3D printing services available for a new project. I immediately reached out to Void, my partner in keyboard crime, and we started brainstorming and going through our backlog of keyboards we wanted to try out. I knew I liked the ergonomics of my previous keyboard, and we were both now sold on wireless keyboards, so whatever we did next had to start from those fundamentals. We eventually settled on the Charybdis, which from now on I will simply refer to as Chary for ease of pronunciation. The keyboard design comes from Lebastard keyboards, and it's centered around a sculpted case that cleverly makes use of flexible PCBs. It has an overall layout that's not too dissimilar to the Corn, and a first for me personally, it also incorporates a trackball. However, there was one problem with the design. It was never really intended to be used wirelessly. Luckily, Void didn't need much convincing and soon started doing research into the necessary mods and parts we needed for a wireless version. The most significant of which was the trackball sensor, as the one needed for a wired build would draw too much power and leave us with poor battery life. We had to source a Pixart PMW3610 sensor, as well as other bits and bobs like heat inserts, screws, and of course the trackballs. Information on existing wireless trackball builds was hard to come by, with research only turning up one other documented build by GitHub user Mike1808, who as far as we know is the first to have made a wireless Chary. We were also very lucky to have come across ufan's ZMK driver and trackball implementation for our sensor, as well as his breakout board, to which Void added mounting holes and modified it with a different pinout. The MCU shield was also simplified, and the matrix pinout was swapped to accommodate the new sensor board. Since our build was going to be wireless, we had to use the ZMK firmware and the awesome but expensive Nice Nano controllers. All the PCBs we needed, as well as the cases, were perfectly suited for manufacturing over at JLC PCB, with the sensor board requiring their PCB assembly service. For the cases, we decided on printing two sets, a 6-column layout printed using the MJF process to be used as my main keyboard, and another 5-column mini layout printed with the SLS process, which will end up in active service over at Void's after the filming of this video is complete. If it sounds like Void did all the hard work to make this happen, that's only because it's true. Some of us like to hang in the shadows, but their work doesn't go unnoticed. Nevertheless, I am now doing my part in bringing this build to light. With everything ready to go, we sent the order to JLC, and shortly after, all the parts were in my mailbox, so to speak. First, we have the sensor boards. These come with all the surface-mounted components pre-installed using JLC PCB's assembly service. Next up, we have the modified MCU shields. This is where the Nice Nano controllers will slot in. Basically, this is the motherboard of the keyboard. These tiny PCBs are the keys on the thumb clusters. And these are the ones for the alphanumerical keys. Because the keyboard has a concave shape, these crucially have to be made thinner than usual so that they can flex without breaking. And finally, we have a bunch of these funky looking parts for the trackball assembly. It was time to quit stalling and get it all assembled, so I took all the parts over to Void, who was kind enough to let me get some cool shots for the video. There weren't many issues that we ran into, except some minor ones. The MJF print turned out to have looser tolerances, likely due to the designs being optimized for FDM printing instead. Because of this, the threaded inserts had to be glued in place. The switches were also relatively loose, but once soldered, this turned out not to be an issue. Strangely, however, the SLS print was much tighter overall and did not present this issue. The other minor thing worth mentioning here is the smaller size of the lens covering our sensor. This too was easily addressed with an additional lens support bracket that Void designed and printed. A few days later, both builds were finished, and to my delight and Void's surprise, fully functional. All the hard work had paid off. As with the Corn, I've been using the Chary as my only keyboard for the past few weeks, so that I could get used to it and provide you guys with my thoughts on it. I don't really know why, but my expectation here was that I would get used to typing on the Chary relatively quickly. However, it did not turn out that way, and after a few weeks in, I would say I'm only about 90% used to it. My typing speed is still quite a bit behind my previous personal records. That said, there is something very comfortable about the shape, and I do find it enjoyable to type on, even cozy for lack of a better word. I do feel, however, that the overall design would be best suited on users with larger hands. One thing I really like is the sound signature. The Gator and Oil King switches work really well here with a deep and satisfying sound. This is perhaps due to the fact that the switches are mounted directly to the case and not to a switch plate. Let's have a listen. Compare this to the sound signature of my Korn, which is using the same switches. Void, on the other hand, opted for Cherry MX Black Hyperglide switches, which underwent burning in and were lubed. Here's a typing test on his 5-column build. While they sound very nice as well, if not even nicer and deeper than the Oil Kings, the feel of these switches falls way short. There's a significant degree of scratchiness, even with the burn-in and lubing mentioned earlier. So let's talk about the whole trackball thing. From a technical standpoint, we were most concerned with stability over Bluetooth and response time. With a few firmware tweaks, the trackball ended up working flawlessly, with next to no perceivable lag or dropouts. There are, however, issues we have noticed when there is significant pollution due to other wireless devices. A good example of this would be when I'm using the two keyboards simultaneously. What happens is that one of them will have choppier trackball input. As soon as I turn one of them off, this issue goes away completely. Just something to be aware of. This was also my first time using a trackball, so I didn't really know what to expect. If I had to summarize it, I'd say it's definitely usable for light desktop use, but it's not a mouse replacement for any work that requires precision. At least when it comes to this particular implementation, very fine, smooth movements are hard to pull off. For other use cases where precision is not as important, however, flicking the ball around is a ton of fun, and it is very satisfying. The ball also has a tendency to partially come out of the holder when doing movements that are too ample. However, this too is something that you adapt to as you get used to the keyboard shape. You can also find practical ways to use the trackball. For instance, here I'm using the trackball to control the color wheels inside DaVinci Resolve, or here where I'm using it to choose conversation options in The Witcher 3. It's up to you really on how to use it, but I can't say it's fully clicked with me just yet. While we're on the topic of gaming, I will say that I don't find this keyboard to be a good match. The sculpted shape in combination with the column stagger makes the standard WASD setup very awkward to use. One thing I can say with absolute certainty, however, is that I love the way both these keyboards look. They have a certain out-of-this-world look, but without being tacky or overly stylized, although the choice of colors plays a part in this as well. Battery life is also surprisingly good, lasting about 7 days, roughly the same battery life I was getting on my Korn build. As we're using the exact same batteries in microcontrollers, this means that the low-power trackball sensor is working as intended. Let's move on to talk about Keymaps. As you can see in this comparison, the general layout I'm using is pretty similar to what I've been using on the Korn keyboard for about a year now. So I simply carried over my preferences with only some minor adjustments. The most significant detail here is that I've swapped the position of the lower and raise keys with the space and enter keys. This positioning feels more natural to me, as the outermost thumb key on the Cherry feels a bit too far out of reach for frequent tapping. Moving the trackball will trigger the mouse keys layer, which will remain active for a set duration. This automatic triggering of the layer can mean accidental key presses, which is why I've positioned the mouse keys as out of the way as possible, so that fast typing doesn't end up in unwanted mouse clicks. There is one other issue I should mention here, but one that is not directly tied to the trackball itself. For some reason, double clicking is unreliable. Most times, this just kind of moves the cursor a few pixels without actually registering the action. The lower layer is where my Alt key had to move, as having a trackball means there's only 2 keys on the right half thumb cluster. This layer also contains my directional keys and my numerical keys as well, laid out in a numpad style grid. On the raise layer we have the Bluetooth controls as well as all the symbols. From here I can also toggle my dedicated game layer, which I can customize to my liking depending on whatever game I'm playing at the time. Let's also take a very brief look over Void's 5-column build and how it's set up. Seeing how a column is lost on each side, you're more or less left with your alpha keys and the thumb clusters. The way to deal with this limitation is to use something called home row mods. All your usual modifier keys such as Alt, Control or Shift are placed on your home row, the row where you should naturally rest your fingers on a keyboard. All those keys now have a dual use. When tapped, they do what they have always done, but when held down, they act as modifiers. I won't go into too much detail here as it's outside the scope of this video, but I will leave a link in the description for an in-depth look at home row mods, as well as a link to the Mirioku keyboard layout that Void is using here. It's time for me to leave you guys with some conclusions, but it's a tough one. I don't know yet if the Cherry will replace my Corn in the long term. It's a fun keyboard to type on and it looks great, but I also feel like I need more time to get used to it. Working on this project was a blast though, and I was happy to see the warm reception received by the previous keyboard videos on the channel. That's something that motivates us to do more of these in the future. I'd like to thank JLCPCB yet again for the support, and a huge thanks to you guys for watching until the end. We are open to suggestions for future keyboard videos, so don't hesitate to share your ideas in the comments. Bye for now.